Jewish community said, and I think with justification, that if the attack on the kosher grocery store had occurred first, and then there had been the attack on the iconic Charlie Hebdo magazine, nobody would even have noticed the attack on the Jewish grocery store, because all the attention was on Charlie Hebdo. And why was this? Because I think this point about free speech is something that people identify with in the wider community. They think it's an attack on free speech, it's an attack on the cartoonist, it's an attack on all of them. And whereas the attack on Jews, well, you know, it doesn't quite fit, and why are Jews being singled out? It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't fit the narrative. Now, free speech is undoubtedly a very important value for free societies, for civilized societies, for Western societies. And the attack on free speech is indeed a very significant and worrying thing. But I would suggest it is not the real issue. It is not the core issue here. I mean, attacks on free speech happen all the time, don't they? Any authoritarian regime in the world attacks free speech. That's what they do. They lock up journalists all the time. They suppress freedom of expression all the time. And we don't all think that this is a terrible thing all the time. If we think about it, we think that's dreadful. But we don't all go on marches and link arms and say we will not allow this to happen. Because obviously it hasn't touched us. But in my view, even though on this occasion it did touch us, in that the French people felt that they were personally, or as a country, being attacked in this core value, I don't think it is the real point at all, because the real point is that the attack on freedom of speech is part of a religious war of conquest being waged against the free world. And that's why the attack on Jews is so significant, for reasons I'll come to in a moment. But immediately it broadens it out. You can see it's a civilizational battle. It's not simply a battle about freedom of speech. It's not about giving offense as we understand it. What we're looking at here, in the attack on Charlie Hebdo, in the attack on the Copenhagen Cafe, and the other attacks on Jews that took place afterwards, we're not looking at here a debating society issue of where the proper boundaries should be drawn between, on the one hand, free expression, and on the other hand, respect for other people. That's certainly an element, but that's not what this issue is actually about. Because what were these people doing when they massacred the people at Charlie Hebdo, and when they sprayed bullets at the cafe where the meeting was taking place to discuss freedom of expression in the particular context of the attempt by Islamists to stop freedom of expression? They were basically saying that stopping the giving of offense to Islam is a means of subjugating people. This is the message, this is the signal they are giving, that stopping the giving of offense to Islam is the means of subjugating people to rule by Islamic precepts and wiping out the non-Islamic or not Islamic enough world in pursuit of which people are going to be killed as they are killed in any war. So we're not talking about freedom of speech, we're talking about something very, very much bigger, of which the freedom of speech element is one element. And I say the not Islamic enough world because I think this is an important point that people don't necessarily understand. This is an attempt to purify the world for what is considered by these people to be authentic Islam. And in the course of that, they are purifying the Islamic world, or purging it, or trying to purge the Islamic world of elements which they think are not Islamic enough, not pure enough. And so Muslims are themselves the most numerous victims of this attempt to purify the world for a particular literal interpretation of Islam which cannot allow for secular human rights. Not all Muslims subscribe to this by any means, as I've just said. Muslims are the most numerous victims of this. There are millions of Muslims who do not subscribe to this idea. But nevertheless, to deny that it is rooted in Islamic thought is, I think, a terrible mistake. Now, people in the West are very reluctant to put it in this kind of context. They are very reluctant to say that this is indeed something to do with Islam, that this is something to do with religious fanaticism. And they are very reluctant also to own up to acknowledge their own hypocrisy and inconsistency. We all saw, after the Charlie Hebdo massacre, we all saw this great slogan, "Je suis Charlie." Everybody said, "Je suis Charlie." Buttons sprouted, stickers sprouted. Everyone said, "Je suis Charlie." Oh yeah? Je suis Charlie? Nobody was suis Charlie. Nobody was prepared to publish those cartoons. Okay, a few of them were published in the event of the special edition of Charlie Hebdo that came out. In Britain, there was a great deal of talk, who is going to publish the cover of Charlie Hebdo? And in those circumstances, people felt they had no option but to publish it. But nevertheless, by and large, people are not publishing those cartoons. People are not publishing those images. And this particular pass was sold years previously. In my view, the most significant marker, the most significant event in this alarming trajectory of the eclipse of freedom of speech was when the pass was sold over the fatwa that was issued against the life of the writer Salman Rushdie in 1989. Some of you may remember that event. Salman Rushdie, a novelist, writer, lived in Britain, published a book called The Satanic Verses, which was held to grievously insult Islam. And a fatwa against his life was promulgated by Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran. And what then happened was that he was forced into hiding for many years. And I think still doesn't lead a completely normal life. Now, the significant thing was this, that when this thing happened in Britain, and this was the first time that an attempt was made to stop freedom of speech in the interests of protecting Islam from insult. What then happened was that there were, and I remember it clearly, there were demonstrations where the book was burned. The book was burned. Now, where I'm coming from, if you burn books, it's a precursor to burning people, but put that to one side. It's a terrible thing to see a book being burned because the symbolism, there is something which we are not going to be, which is not going to be allowed to be published. This cannot be spoken about. That's a terrible thing to do in Britain, home of freedom of expression. And people march behind this banner of Salman Rushdie's offence, and they, some of them actually supported his murder, and others blamed him for having brought this upon themselves. Now, the pass was sold because nobody was prosecuted for supporting his murder. Nobody, it's a crime. You incite murder, you support somebody being murdered, it's in this incitement to murder, you're prosecuted. Nobody was prosecuted. And the people who stood up and said, it's his fault, he knew what he was doing, he deliberately set out to insult Islam, he must therefore pay the penalty. Hello? Pay the penalty? What are they talking about? And then there was a silence, because people didn't rise up and say, of these people who were saying this, that it was his fault. People didn't rise up and say, that's a terrible thing to say, we have to protect freedom of speech, we have to support Salman Rushdie, whatever he's written, we must support him. They didn't say that. They didn't say that. Britain did not support him. And the message was very much taken. In the media, in the publishing world, in the world of culture, everybody understood. If you say something that is held to be insulting to Islam, you are at risk now of your life, and that nobody will come to support you. And so from that moment, there was no discussion, no proper discussion that took place, and to this day, in the British media about Islam. None. It was just not done. Everybody knew that it was too much of a risk. And then, years moved on, we had other stuff like this. You remember the stuff about the Muhammad cartoons being published? As a result of the Muhammad cartoons being published, there were riots across the world, and a number of people died in those riots. And people didn't say, generally, that's a terrible thing. That, first of all, that it's a terrible thing to suppress the freedom of expression of these cartoons, because freedom of speech is important. And second, it's even worse that that should lead to people being murdered. No, people didn't say that. In Britain, they said, it's the cartoonist's fault. It's the cartoonist's fault. It's provocative. What did they expect? And no one published those cartoons in Britain and elsewhere. So what we've had since the Salman Rushdie affair is self-censorship when it comes to the Islamic world. Worse than that, worse than the self-censorship, is that if anybody does say there is something very wrong in an Islamic world that wants to suppress freedom of speech like this, and worse, kills people or engenders an atmosphere in which people are killed as a result, if you say that and many other things that are critical of the Islamic world, people in Britain and the West say that to say such things is Islamophobia. In other words, you can't say it. It's a kind of thought crime. It's an expression of hatred. It's an expression of prejudice. It's an expression of bigotry. And so, discussion about whether the West is at risk from religious fanaticism in the world of Islam has been deemed to be an expression of bigotry, and therefore we cannot have that discussion. And so this has taken the Muslim world's own attempt to silence freedom of speech over this very necessary discussion and criticism of those Islamic doctrines that are inimical to freedom. Worse even still, this thought crime of Islamophobia turns crimes committed within the Islamic world into crimes committed against the Islamic world, perpetrated by its victims. In other words, it turns victims into oppressors and oppressors into victims. It is a completely mind-bending concept. And this, of course, in my view, is exactly what has happened, incidentally, in the Arab war against Israel. Arab terror, Arab ethnic cleansing, Arab racial persecution, and deliberately procuring the deaths of children have all been blamed falsely upon Israel, while the world blinds itself to the way these things are being done to Israel. We're looking at an inversion of truth and lies, an inversion of victim and victimizer, an inversion of reality, and a departure from reason. Now, after the Charlie Hebdo and associated massacres, people said to themselves and asked, is this a tipping point? After all, world leaders had marched through Paris with linked arms. We are going to defend this. This is where we're going to make our stand. And so people say, well, maybe this is the tipping point. Maybe this is where Europe fights back. Maybe this is where the West fights back and says we will really will defend our principles against attack. Well, I don't think it was a tipping point at all, because I think that the West still will not acknowledge this threat for what it is. It will not acknowledge that the source of the problem is an interpretation of Islam that has become dominant in the Islamic world largely through force. And I say that through force because, again, I must reinforce the point. There are many Muslims who are the victims of this. There are many Muslims who do not subscribe to it, who want their religion to be reformed. I mean, for goodness sake, we had recently General Sisi of Egypt making a tremendously important address at the Al-Azhar University in Cairo, in which he said, he implored this audience of imams in front of him. He implored them. He said, we must have an Islamic revolution. It is simply impossible for a situation to be as it is, where 1.6 billion Muslims wish to procure the annihilation of the remaining 7 billion Muslims in the world. He said that. He said, the religion has been taken over by something that is terrible and we have to get rid of it. We have to reform the religion. And there are a number of Muslims, I think very, very brave Muslims, decent people, who are standing up and saying this. The ground is being cut from under their feet by a political class in Western Europe, and I think also in America, which is going to enormous lengths to avoid saying this is anything to do with the religion. And if you say this has got nothing to do with the religion, well then there's no point reforming it, is there? Because if there's no problem with the religion, why should anyone want to reform it? So they are cutting the ground from under these reformers' feet. And it's quite astonishing. After Paris, when Francois Hollande, the prime minister or president of Paris, he marched, shoulder to shoulder, linked arms with all these other good folks, saying, "Here we stand." He said what had happened in Paris was nothing to do with Islam. President Obama has produced countless formulations for pretending that Islamic violence is un-Islamic. He has said, for example, that it can't be Islamic violence because Muslims are amongst its victims. But as I've said, this is because this interpretation of the religion is intent on purging the not Islamic enough world of backsliding and secular influences like equal rights. Prime Minister David Cameron of Britain said after the near decapitation on the streets of London in broad daylight of drummer Lee Rigby, an off-duty soldier, he was almost decapitated by two men who were, as I recall, Muslim converts, who brandished machetes, bloody machetes, after they left his bloody body on the floor, with amazed shoppers and passers-by and people on the bus looking on, and spouted verses from the Quran. And Prime Minister Cameron said after this astounding event, "There is nothing in Islam that justifies acts of terror." After the burning alive of the Jordanian pilot hostage, you may recall recently this terrible thing that we saw, Islamic State or ISIS having apparently burned this guy alive in a metal cage, a Jordanian pilot taken hostage. After that had happened, and after we were shown this terrible video, the British Foreign Office said, quote, "ISIS is not Islam. It is extremism, hiding under the banner of religion to carry out barbaric, appalling atrocities against Muslims and non-Muslims alike." Now, you have to really wonder how people can say this with a straight face. I mean, ISIS, it has announced that it has set up an Islamic caliphate. Now, whether or not that is true is not the point. It is identifying itself with a tenet of Islamic culture, Islamic religion. It identifies itself as Islamic with everything that it does. So to say it's not Islam is just completely absurd. It is extremism hiding under the banner of religion. What on earth does that mean? Why can't it be religious extremism? No, it can't be religious extremism. It's extremism pretending to be religion. Now, why are all these people going to these enormous lengths to deny what this thing is? Then they say, after these beheadings started, after the Islamic State started beheading all these Western hostages, David Cameron again said, there is no religion which sanctions this, as if this was something new. After this terrible burning, people said, there is no religion that sanctions this, as if it was something new. But in Islam, it is not new. In Africa, across Africa, Christians have been burned alive in their churches, burned alive. There was a recent terrible, terrible thing where a family of Christians was held over a kiln and dropped in. I mean, you won't read about this in the Western media very much because it doesn't fit the narrative. All people care about is, oh my goodness, they've killed cartoonists, it's freedom of speech. What about